The night everything changed, it was raining in Manchester. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of rain that arrives in stories at exactly the right moment to signal that something important is about to happen. Not that kind. Not the thunder and lightning variety that the movies have trained us to associate with turning points and revelations, and the particular quality of darkness that precedes transformation. Just the ordinary Manchester rain, the persistent, indifferent, horizontal kind that has no interest in narrative and no awareness of the fact that a 17-year-old boy was sitting on the floor of a dormitory bathroom in Carrington with his back against the cold tiles and his knees drawn up to his chest, and his face doing something that he would have been mortified for anyone to see. The face of a person who has reached the end of something and doesn't yet know what comes next. The face. Though he didn't have this language for it then, though this language would take years to arrive, of a person who has run so far ahead of himself that the self has stopped being able to keep up. He had been at Manchester United for 4 months. For months of being exactly as good as everyone had said he would be, for months of training sessions that left senior players standing still and watching with expressions that mixed admiration with something more complicated, for months of a city that was nothing like Madeira, and a language he was still assembling from its component parts, and a loneliness so total and so structurally perfect that it had its own geometry, its own internal logic, the kind of loneliness that isn't the product of being without people. He was surrounded by people, was never not surrounded by people, but the product of being surrounded by people who knew the player and not the person, who had decided what he was before he arrived and related to that decision rather than to him, and who could not have known, because he had given them no information with which to know, that underneath the player was someone considerably more frightened and considerably more fragile than the player's performance suggested. He sat on the bathroom floor and listened to the rain against the window and thought about Madeira. Not the postcard version, not the flowers and the cliffs and the Atlantic blue, but the specific, particular, irreplaceable version that only exists when a place is the place you come from, the version made of smell and texture and the specific quality of light at certain hours, the steep streets and the sound of his mother in the kitchen and the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder, the weight that meant something specific, that had a language of its own, that said things the voice didn't say, that said you are mine, and I am here, and the world is large, but this small pressure, this is permanent. He thought about that weight. He thought about how far away it was. He thought about the fact that he had chosen this, had wanted this, had worked for this with every cell of himself since he was old enough to understand what working for something meant, and that the choosing made the loneliness no smaller, which was a thing he hadn't known before, and which turned out to be one of the most important things he would ever learn. That wanting something and having it doesn't resolve the wanting, doesn't fill the space the wanting occupied, doesn't answer the
question the wanting was asking.
It just moves you to the next question. It just reveals the next room. He sat there for a long time, and then he got up. He washed his face. He went back to his room. And at 5:45 the next morning, before any alarm, before any obligation, before anyone else in the building was awake, he was already on the training pitch in the Manchester rain, doing the work because the work was the thing he knew how to do, because the work was the one place where none of the other things could reach him, because the work was, if not a solution, then at least a direction, and direction, even when you are 17 and homesick and sitting on a bathroom floor at midnight, is always better than stillness. That morning was the beginning of something. Not the beginning of his career, that had begun years before, in Lisbon, in Madeira, in 1,000 early mornings that preceded this one, but the beginning of a pattern, a structure, a way of living inside a life that was going to make extraordinary demands and offer extraordinary rewards and ask, in ways he didn't yet understand, a price that wasn't listed on any contract and wasn't negotiated by any agent and wasn't mentioned in any of the conversations that had brought him here. The price of being what he was going to become. The price of the number one. The price that you don't know you're paying until you've been paying it for so long that you can no longer clearly remember what you were like before the payments began. To understand where Cristiano Ronaldo arrived, you have to understand where he started. And where he started was a place that the record books mention briefly and move past quickly, because the record books are interested in what happened later, in the numbers and the trophies and the historic firsts, in the story that justifies all the attention rather than the story that explains all the hunger. But the hunger always begins somewhere specific, always has a location and a texture and a particular face attached to it, and Ronaldo's hunger began in Santo Antonio, in a small house on an island in the Atlantic Ocean, in a family that had very little of most things and a great deal of each other, and in the particular, complicated, permanently unresolved relationship between a boy and his father that would shape everything that came after it in ways that took decades to fully trace. Dennis Severo was a kit man. He worked for a local football club, which meant he spent his days close to a game he loved and at a permanent slight distance from it, in the support structure rather than the thing being supported, doing the work that allowed other people to do the work that got celebrated. He was a good man in the way that good men often are, not perfectly, not without the complications that all people carry, not in a way that was uncomplicated by his own struggles, which were real and which had a name, and which the family had learned to live around the way you live around something that cannot be removed, that must simply be accommodated, that is part of the architecture rather than a removable feature. He was warm. He was funny in the unpretentious way of people who have no investment in being seen as funny, who are just genuinely, naturally, effortlessly amusing in the ordinary run of daily life. He loved his children with an urgency that sometimes expressed itself as pressure and sometimes as tenderness, and was always, underneath either of those expressions, the same thing: the love of a man who understood that the world was capable of taking things, who had personal experience of that capability, and who was therefore constitutionally unable to take his children's futures for granted in the way that people who have never lost anything significant tend to take things for granted. Cristiano was the youngest, the smallest for a long time, the one who cried too easily and felt everything too visibly and had to be told, more than once, in the way of families who are trying to prepare their children for a world that is not gentle, that feelings were not something you displayed publicly if you wanted to be taken seriously, that the face you showed the world needed to be a different face from the one you showed at home, that performance and privacy were two different registers, and confusing them was a kind of vulnerability you couldn't afford. He learned this lesson thoroughly. He learned it so thoroughly that by the time he was an adult it had become invisible, had become the texture of how he moved through the world rather than a conscious strategy he was implementing, had become so deeply embedded in the structure of his behavior that even he, in the most honest moments of his most honest hours, sometimes lost track of which face was which. The football was always there. From so early that memory couldn't reach back to a time before it, from an age where most children's relationship with the ball is still purely physical and undirected, Ronaldo had a relationship with the ball that was qualitatively different from the children around him, a quality of attention, of intention, of the specific and legible desire to make the ball do things it wasn't naturally inclined to do, that coaches and parents and older boys watching from the sides of pitches noticed immediately and unanimously and described, each of them, in the same instinctive language: he's different. Not better, necessarily, not yet. Talent at that age is still too raw to be reliably measured, but different. Operating from a different place. Driven by something that the other children didn't seem to have access to, or didn't seem to need access to, something internal and self-generated and entirely unrelated to praise or encouragement or the validation of adults, something that would have been there even in an empty field with no one watching, probably would have been more purely itself in an empty field with no one watching. His father watched him from the touchline at local matches with an expression that the people who remembered it described, years later, as the most uncomplicated happiness they had ever seen on his face. Not pride, exactly, or not only pride, but something simpler and more fundamental than pride, the happiness of watching someone you love do the thing they were made to do, the thing they couldn't stop themselves from doing, the thing that exists in them not as ambition or choice but as fact, as nature, as the basic irreducible truth of who they are. Dennis had worked around football his whole adult life without ever being close to the center of it, and watching his son, his smallest child, his most feeling child, the one who cried and had to be told not to, watching that child move toward the center with a sureness that made the movement look inevitable, made the destination look like it had always been there waiting, made the whole arc of it look less like achievement and more like recognition, like arrival at a place that had always been his. Watching that, from a touchline, in the Atlantic light, on a steep street island that the rest of the world had not yet heard of, was the closest Dennis Severo ever came to a feeling for which he had no name but which his body knew entirely. He never saw Old Trafford. He never heard 70,000 people chant his son's name. He died in 2005, when Ronaldo was 20 years old and had been at Manchester United for 2 years and was already, visibly and undeniably, becoming what he was going to become. He died in a hospital in Funchal, with Ronaldo at his bedside, on a morning that had no special weather, just an ordinary morning, the kind that doesn't know or care about the significance of what it's being asked to contain, and what Ronaldo carried out of that. Hospital was a weight that did not diminish with time, that did not become lighter as the years and the trophies accumulated, that remained exactly the same specific gravity, regardless of everything else, the weight of a man who would never see the thing his son was about to become, who had loved the beginning of the story without ever knowing the middle or the end, who had stood on a touchline in Madeira watching a small boy do something extraordinary and had felt something for which he had no name, and who would never, now, be able to watch that boy become the noun his talent was always moving toward. That weight became part of the architecture too. That weight became one of the things that drove the early mornings, the obsessive preparation, the refusal to accept any result that didn't represent the absolute upper limit of what was possible. Not the only thing. There were others, there were many others. The hunger had multiple sources and multiple histories, but one of the load-bearing ones, one of the ones that didn't change shape when everything else was going well, that was there on the good nights and the bad nights and the ordinary nights with equal consistency, that asked its question, was this enough? Was this worthy? Would you have been proud? Without caring about the scoreboard or the headlines or the judgment of history. The question never got an answer. But it never stopped being asked in the years that followed. The years of Manchester and Madrid and Turin and the national team and the individual awards and the records that fell one by one like trees in a forest that seemed endless and turned out to be finite, like everything. A version of Cristiano Ronaldo was constructed for public consumption that was accurate in its broad outlines and systematically misleading in its details. The version was of a man defined by confidence, by an absolute and unwavering certainty in his own exceptional quality that functioned as armor and as fuel simultaneously, that made him impervious to doubt and immune to the ordinary vulnerabilities that limited other people, that allowed him to stand in the center of the most pressurized situations in world sport and perform not just adequately but magnificently, with a consistency and a quality that had no reasonable explanation except the one that the version offered. That he was simply built differently, that the interior life of Cristiano Ronaldo was a smooth and frictionless place where doubt had no purchase and fear had no address, and the only thing present in any significant quantity was the clean, powerful, forward-directed energy of a man who knew exactly what he was and was entirely at peace with it. This version was useful. He had helped to construct it. He had made specific decisions over many years about what to show and what to keep, about which interviews to give and which questions to deflect, about how to carry himself in public and what expressions to wear on what occasions and what to say when the cameras were rolling and what to feel when they weren't. And the version that had resulted from all those decisions and all those years was convincing enough to have become, for most of the world, the definitive one, the one that got repeated. In the articles and the analysis pieces and the locker room conversations of players who had faced him, repeated with the same kind of certainty that facts acquire when they've been in circulation long enough that no one remembers questioning them. But versions constructed for consumption leave things out. They have to. That's part of the construction, part of the editorial process, the necessary reduction of a complex and contradictory human being to a legible and transmissible story, and the things left out are never random, are always the things that don't fit, that complicate the central claim, that introduce into the clean narrative the kind of mess and ambivalence and unresolved texture that real interior lives actually consist of, but that public versions cannot afford. What got left out of the Ronaldo version was the bathroom floor in Carrington. The weight that didn't diminish. The hotel rooms. The question that never got answered. The specific quality of silence in the early mornings on empty pitches that was not the silence of a man at peace with himself, but the silence of a man who had found the one place where his interior noise had somewhere to go that wasn't destructive, who had turned the noise into fuel, and the fuel into work, and the work into results, and the results into a story that the world could consume, and who had done this so consistently and so successfully for so long that the transformation had become invisible, had become indistinguishable from the thing it was pretending to be, had become, And this was the part that was hardest to hold in your mind for very long without it shifting into something else, had become, in a certain light, real. Because here is the complicated truth about constructed versions of the self. They don't stay constructed. They don't stay at the distance you put them at. They have a way of collapsing the gap between what you perform and what you are, not because the performance becomes genuine, but because performing something long enough and thoroughly enough changes the performer, reshapes them at a level below conscious intention, makes them into someone for whom the performance is no longer entirely separate from the person because the person has been shaped by the performance for too long to clearly disentangle them. Ronaldo had been performing confidence for 30 years. He had, in a meaningful sense, become confident, not in the version's frictionless, invulnerable way, but in a real and earned and hard-won way, the confidence of someone who has tested themselves against the hardest available tests long enough to have accumulated genuine evidence that they are capable of the thing they are claiming to be capable of. The performance had produced something real. The version had generated, through continuous repetition, a person who actually inhabited it, who was no longer entirely separate from it, who was the version and also its author simultaneously, in the specific doubled way of people who have spent their lives in the complicated space between who they are and who they have decided to be. This did not make the bathroom floor in Carrington not real. Both things were real. Both things remained real. That was the part that was hardest to explain to people who needed the story to be simpler than it was, who needed the extraordinary person to be either entirely constructed or entirely authentic, who couldn't hold the more demanding truth that it was both, that most extraordinary people are both. That the thing that makes someone capable of what Ronaldo was capable of is almost always the same thing that makes the hotel room silent at midnight, almost always the same wound and the same engine. Almost always the thing that drives and the thing that costs, inhabiting the same space with a closeness that makes separation impossible and explanation inadequate. The Madrid years were the years the world decided on. The years that, in the story of Cristiano Ronaldo that history will tell, will occupy the most space, will be given the most words, will be returned to most often when the argument needs evidence. The years of the Bernabeu and the Champions League nights, and the records that accumulated within. Inevitability that suggested not just talent but something closer to fate, the kind of accumulation that seems, from a distance, like the natural expression of a force of nature rather than the product of specific choices made by a specific person on specific mornings when the choice would have been easier not to make. For Champions Leagues, hundreds of goals, the individual awards that arrived with the regularity of seasons, that became the metric by which the largest argument in football was measured, that placed him permanently inside a comparison that he privately found less interesting than the world needed it to be. He was more interested in the work. This confused people. It confused them because from the outside the trophies and the awards looked like the point, looked like the destination toward which everything else was directed, and the idea that the person who had collected them in those quantities might be more animated by the process of pursuing them than by the having of them seemed either false modesty or a failure of self-awareness, neither of which fitted the version. But it was true, and it was true in a way that illuminated something important about what the work actually was and what it was actually for. The work was not a means to the trophies. The work was not instrumental. The work was the place where the relationship between who he was and what he was doing was clean and clear and unmediated by the opinions of other people, by the needs of the story, by the weight that didn't diminish or the question that didn't get answered, the place where it was just him and the ball and the specific, concrete, manageable problem of making the ball do the thing he needed it to do better than he had made it do that thing yesterday, which was a problem with an objective measure and a definite answer, and a feedback loop that was reliable and honest in a way that most of life was not. The other players saw it. Not all of them understood it, but they all saw it. The early arrivals and late departures, the additional sessions after the official sessions had ended, the quality of attention that he brought to drills that his talent had long since made unnecessary in any purely skill development sense, the way he treated training with a seriousness that veterans of the game, men who had seen thousands of training sessions across careers that spanned decades, described as singular, as something they hadn't seen before and didn't have a good frame for, something that occupied a different category from dedication or professionalism or even love of the game, something that was closer in their descriptions to need, the training as a thing he required rather than a thing he chose, The pitch as the one place where the requirements of being Cristiano Ronaldo could be temporarily suspended in favor of the simpler, more manageable, more honest requirements of being a body with a ball and a set of problems worth solving. What they couldn't see, what the training ground didn't show, what the performance concealed so effectively that even people who spent years close to him tended to miss it, was the texture of the hours that weren't the training. The mornings before and the evenings after, and the nights in between, the specific quality of silence in the spaces where the work wasn't happening, the way that silence had a different character from the silence on the empty pitch, was populated by different things, made different demands. The pitch silence was productive. It was the silence of concentration, of focus, of a mind engaged entirely with the thing in front of it, leaving no bandwidth for the other things to occupy. The room's silence was different. The room's silence was where the other things lived, where the weight that didn't diminish settled back onto its original location, where the question that didn't get answered resumed its patient, permanent asking, where the version and the person had no useful relationship with each other because the performance requires an audience, and the room at midnight is not an audience. He managed the room's silence the way he managed everything else, with discipline, with routine, with the construction of structures that occupied the hours that might otherwise have been occupied by unstructured feeling. The sleep schedules and the nutritional protocols and the recovery systems that sports science journalists wrote about admiringly and somewhat breathlessly, that were described as evidence of a scientific approach to physical performance that was ahead of its time, that positioned him as a pioneer of athlete self-management. Those systems were all of those things. They were genuinely and measurably effective at the physical level, but they were also at a level that the sports science articles didn't reach, a way of filling the rooms with something other than the silence, of replacing the quiet hours with tasks that had clear parameters and measurable outcomes, and left no space for the kind of open-ended, unresolvable, quietly devastating contemplation that waits for you in the unstructured moments of a life lived mostly alone at altitude. He was not unhappy, he would have said, and this would have been true. He was not unhappy in the way that people are unhappy when their lives are going wrong, when the things they wanted aren't coming or the things they feared are arriving, when the world is actively withholding something they need. He had everything that success was supposed to bring. He had proof, daily and overwhelming and impossible to dispute, that he was the best at the thing he had given his life to. He had more of almost everything than he would ever need or use.
He was not unhappy.
He was something else. He was something for which unhappy was the wrong word, a word that belonged to a different kind of life, a life in which the main problem was the gap between what you had and what you wanted, and that gap was not his problem. His problem was more specific and harder to name. It was the silence on the other side of the noise, the room behind the performance, the question that the best version of his life kept generating and that none of the answers the world offered had yet resolved. It was the distance between the person standing in the center of 70,000 people chanting his name and the person who drove home afterward and walked into a house that was large and beautiful and entirely ready to receive him and sat down somewhere in the middle of it and felt the particular weight of a silence that was not restful, but was its own kind of work, its own kind of demand, its own kind of question asking quietly and without pause. Is this it? Is this what it was for? Is this the thing that the boy on the bathroom floor in Carrington was moving toward? And if so, what does the boy think of it? And does the boy still exist in here somewhere? And would the boy recognize himself in this? And would the boy be satisfied? And would the father on the touchline watching, feeling the feeling he had no name for, would the father say, yes, this is what I saw coming. This is what I felt in my chest watching you. This is the thing you were always moving
toward.
He didn't know. He had never known. He suspected he was not going to know. The question of the rival, the comparison, the debate, the argument that the football world had been conducting with itself for the better part of 2 decades and showed no signs of concluding, was something Ronaldo carried differently from how the world imagined he carried it. The world imagined he carried it as a wound or as a fire, as either the source of a pain that motivated him or the source of an anger that fueled him, because both of those were clean narratives. Both of those gave the comparison a dramatic function in his story, made it useful as an explanation for the extraordinary levels of output that his career had produced, made it part of the engine in a way that was satisfying to the people who needed the engine to have a face. And there was truth in both of those narratives. He was competitive in a way that was not casual or comfortable or easily contained, that extended to every situation that contained a measurable dimension, that made the presence of another person operating at a comparable level in a comparable field feel not irrelevant, but very relevant indeed. The relevance of a mirror that reflects not your face but your standing, your rank, your position in the order of things. But the comparison was not the primary source of the fuel. The primary source had a different address, a different origin story, a different face. The primary source was the bathroom floor in Carrington, was the touchline in Madeira, was the hospital corridor in Funchal on an ordinary morning, was the specific question that had been asking itself since before the comparison existed, since before the rival existed, since before most of what the world used to explain Ronaldo's hunger existed. A question that would have been there even in a world where he had no competition, where the comparison had never been made, where he existed in a category entirely alone, which in some ways he did, which was part of the problem rather than the solution. He talked about this once, in an interview that was not aired in its entirety, that was edited down to the sections the broadcaster decided were appropriate for the story they had already decided to tell. In the unaired section, which was described by the journalist who conducted the interview as the most honest thing they had heard in 30 years of interviewing elite athletes, described in those terms specifically, in the language of surprise that honest things tend to generate in contexts that have learned not to expect them, he said something that was less a statement than an admission, less a thing he was saying for the first time than a thing he was saying out loud for the first time, a thing that had been present for years and was only now, in a room with a camera and a journalist who had asked a question that was slightly different from the usual questions finding its way into speech. He said, "I don't think it's about winning anymore. I think it stopped being about winning a long time ago. I think I would keep going even if the winning stopped because the winning was never the thing. The thing is something I can't give you a name for. The thing is something I look for every morning when I go to train, and some mornings I find it and some mornings I don't. And the mornings I don't find it are the mornings I train longer, because the searching is the closest I know how to get to it. And the stopping has never felt like an option, not because of the trophies or the records or anything outside me, but because of something inside, something that was there before any of it, and will be there after, something that I think my father understood about me before I understood it about myself, and that I have been trying for 30 years to live up to." The journalist had asked, quietly, what he thought his father would say if he could see what he had become. Ronaldo had been silent for a long time. Then he had said, "I think he'd say I'd done well. And then he'd say I should go get some rest." He had laughed at that, a real laugh, the sudden involuntary kind, the kind that arrives from somewhere genuine before the machinery of management can intercept it, and for a moment the version was entirely absent, and what was present was just a man in his late 30s who missed his father, and had found a funny and true way to say it, and the journalist had had the sense and the decency to let the moment exist without doing anything to it, to let it just be what it was in the room, unframed and unexploited. The camera had kept running. The broadcaster had cut it. The years after Madrid were the years of a different kind of pressure. Not the pressure of being at the peak. He had lived in that pressure for long enough that it had become something like weather, something he moved through rather than something that acted on him, something whose texture he knew well enough to navigate without thinking about it consciously. The pressure of the years after was the pressure of time, of the specific relationship between elite physical performance and the passage of time that no amount of scientific management and nutritional precision and recovery protocol innovation had yet found a way to fully suspend, and which began to make itself known not dramatically, but in the incremental, undeniable, data-driven way that truth tends to make itself known when you have the measuring instruments sensitive enough to detect it. The fractions of a second, the slight reductions in the explosiveness that had been his signature, the recovery times that were longer by amounts that no one but him would have noticed, and that he noticed with the same precision and the same dispassion that he brought to all measurable things. Looking at the numbers the way you look at numbers, when the numbers are telling you something you already knew was coming and have been preparing for, and have prepared for well, and are still, when it arrives, not entirely ready for. He trained longer. He recovered harder. He applied the same relentless, systematic, total commitment to the management of his physical decline that he had applied to the development of his physical peak, which was in many ways the most Ronaldo thing about the entire latter portion of his career. The refusal to allow a process that was beyond his control to proceed without his fullest possible engagement, The insistence on meeting even the inevitabilities with the posture of someone who has not given up, who is still in the room, who is still showing up at 5:45 in the rain and doing the work, regardless of what the work can and cannot achieve at this
particular point in time.
He could not stop time. He knew he could not stop time. He trained as if he had not yet fully accepted this. The people around him watched this with a mixture of admiration and something more complicated that was hard to name without sounding unkind, an unease that came from watching someone apply their greatest strength to a situation that their greatest strength could not, by definition, resolve, like watching someone who is exceptionally good at building things try to build their way out of something that isn't a building problem. The commitment was real. The results were still extraordinary by any ordinary standard. But the gap between what he was doing and what he had been doing at the peak was visible to the people who had been there for both, was measurable in the metrics that he measured more obsessively than any of them, was the source of a private, ongoing reckoning that found no external expression because external expression of this particular thing, the diminishment, the approach of an ending, the confrontation with the limits of what even the most exceptional human will and the most disciplined human body can sustain was not compatible with the version, was not something the version had a language for, was the one thing that all the carefully managed interviews and all the controlled public appearances and all the 30 years of continuous performance had been specifically constructed not to show. He showed it nowhere. He held it everywhere. There was a night in the second year of his return to Manchester, a night that was not recorded in any particularly significant way, that did not produce a result or a headline or a memorable moment that the retrospectives would return to, just an ordinary night in the middle of an ordinary run of ordinary matches. When Ronaldo arrived at the training ground at 5:30 in the morning and found that someone else was already there, a youth player, 17 years old, from somewhere in West Africa, arrived in Manchester 6 months ago on the kind of opportunity that arrives for a very few people who are very exceptional and very lucky in the specific right combination, sitting in the stands of a training pitch that was dark except for the floodlights at one end, with a ball at his feet and earphones in, and a quality of concentration that Ronaldo recognized immediately the way you recognize something that is native to you, that exists in you, that you encounter in others so rarely that encountering it always produces a small private jolt of something that is partly pleasure and partly the slightly disorientating experience of being seen from the outside. The boy hadn't noticed him, was doing something with the ball at his feet, a repetition, the same movement practiced and repracticed with the specific patient focus of someone who is not performing for an audience but is in genuine conversation with a problem, who is trying to solve something, who cares about the solving more than the watching. Ronaldo stood at the entrance for a moment. He thought about a pitch in Madeira. He thought about 5:45 in the rain. He thought about 30 years of identical mornings, the same problem approached from slightly different angles, the same conversation with the same ball that had been going on his entire adult life without resolution, without the problem ever being fully solved, without the conversation ever being fully concluded, and which had nevertheless been the most honest, and the most continuous, and the most fundamentally his relationship of anything in his life, more honest than any interview, and more continuous than any friendship, and more fundamentally his than any trophy. He thought about his father on the touchline. He walked onto the pitch. The boy looked up. He went very still in the way that people go still when they are surprised by the arrival of someone they weren't expecting in a context that doesn't have a precedent, not frightened, just recalibrating, adjusting the frame of the moment to accommodate the new information. Ronaldo sat down in the stands, a few meters away. They looked at each other. Then Ronaldo said, in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than asking a question, "You're here early." The boy said, "I couldn't sleep." Ronaldo was quiet for a moment. "Neither could I," he said. "I never could. Not the night before a session." The boy looked at him in the careful way of someone who is trying to understand whether what is happening is what it appears to be. "Does it get easier?" he said. Ronaldo thought about this for longer than the question might have seemed to require, thought about it genuinely, which was unusual, because he had been asked versions of this question hundreds of times in hundreds of interviews and had answered them with the smooth efficiency of a person who has a version and knows how to deliver it, but this was a different question in a different register, asked by a person who was not looking for the version, who was sitting on a pitch at 5:30 in the morning and who wanted specifically and genuinely to know. "No," Ronaldo said. "Not easier. Different. You get better at it. You get better at using it. But it doesn't go away. He paused. It shouldn't go away. The boy nodded slowly, as if this was what he had expected to hear and what he needed to hear and what he was going to need to hold on to going forward. They sat in silence for a while. Then they both went down to the pitch and began to work. The conversation he never had, the one he had been unable to have since 2005, since an ordinary morning in a hospital in Funchal, was a conversation he conducted privately, in the way of people who have carried something for long enough that it has become a kind of internal relationship, a dialogue that exists in the space where a person used to be, that continues to develop and deepen and produce new questions even in the absence of the person who is supposed to be its other half. He was in his late 30s when he understood this clearly, understood it not as a metaphor or a coping mechanism, but as a literal description of what was happening in the private hours, in the room behind the performance, in the space between the trophies and the question. He was talking to his father. He had been talking to his father for 20 years. The conversation had no answers because one side of it was silent, but it had questions and it had a direction, and it had a consistency and a continuity that his other relationships, managed, professional, conducted at the surface level of the version, frequently lacked. What he said in that conversation was not primarily about football. Not about the records or the trophies or the places he had been, and the things he had done, and the ways he had exceeded every expectation that anyone had formed before he arrived. He said some of that, it would have been strange not to, given that his father had known what was coming and had felt it in his chest on a touchline in Madeira, and had never seen how it resolved, but most of what he said was the other thing, the thing that wasn't in the record books, the thing that the version didn't contain, the honest accounting of what the life had actually been like from the inside, the bathroom floor in Carrington and the hotel rooms at midnight, and the question that had been asking itself for 30 years without getting a clean answer, the weight that had never diminished, and the silence that had never been comfortable, and the work that had been the best and truest and most continuous thing in his life, and that had been, simultaneously, the evidence and the avoidance, the self-expression and the self-concealment, the place he was most himself, and the place that required him, by its nature, to be most alone. He told his father he had missed him, not in the past tense, not as a thing he had once done and then recovered from, the way grief is supposed to work if you do it correctly and give it enough time. In the present tense. Actively, currently, on a continuing basis, with no reduction. He told his father he had missed him specifically on the nights after the biggest wins, which was the thing that was hardest to explain to people who hadn't experienced it, the counterintuitive truth that the biggest wins were among the loneliest nights, that the scale of the achievement and the scale of the audience and the scale of the noise that attended the achievement made the specific, particular, irreplaceable absence of the one person whose presence would have mattered most more acute. Rather than less, more present rather than less, more impossible to ignore rather than more possible to. He told his father he thought he had done well. He told his father he thought he had done what he was supposed to do. He told his father he thought he would keep going a little longer. He said all of this in the silence of a room at midnight in a city somewhere, with the trophies in another room and the phone with its notifications and the city beyond the window and the rain. There was usually rain. In his private accounting, he always placed the conversations in the rain, which was not accurate to the geography but accurate to the feeling, and he sat there in that rain-sound silence and he said what he had to say, and he listened, in the careful way of people who are hoping for something that they know is not coming, and then he got up and went to bed. He was up at 5:30. He was on the pitch before the lights came on. He was working. He was always working. And the work was the conversation continuing, was the only answer available, the only response the silence could produce that was worth receiving, the only thing he had found in 30 years that came close to answering the question that the question always was, whether it had been worth it, whether the price had been fair, whether the boy from Madeira would recognize himself in the man who kept showing up at 5:30 in the rain to talk to a ball that could not talk back on a pitch that could not tell him what he needed to know, whether any of it had been what it was supposed to be, whether the father on the touchline watching, feeling the feeling he had no name for, whether that father would stand there now watching this and feel the same thing. He thought yes. He thought on the mornings when the work was going well, and the light was coming up over the empty stadium, and the ball was doing what he needed it to do, and the silence was the good kind, the productive kind, the kind that held rather than swallowed. On those mornings he thought yes, this is what you saw, This is what you felt. This is what you had no name for, and it is still happening. It is still going. I am still here. I am still doing the work. I have not stopped. I will not stop, not. Yet, not while there is still something left to find out here, not while the ball is still honest with me, not while the mornings are still available and the body still mostly cooperates and the question is still asking itself with enough energy to constitute, if not hope exactly, then something in the same family, something in the same general direction as hope, something worth getting up for. He got up. He always got up. The city was still dark. The pitch was waiting. He tied his boots in the particular way he had tied them every morning for 30 years, and he went out into it, and the cold hit his face the way cold always hits a face that is expecting it and not minding the expectation, and he stood there for a moment with the ball at his feet and the stadium empty in every direction and the sky beginning, very slowly, very reluctantly, to become something other than night. And he felt the thing he always felt in this specific moment, this moment that had preceded 30 years of days, and that would precede whatever days were still coming, the thing that was not happiness and not peace and not satisfaction and not pride, that was not any of the things he was supposed to feel and frequently described feeling, and that was, in those official descriptions, both true and incomplete, the thing that lived underneath all of those things, that was older than any of them, that was the boy in the window seat on the plane, and the boy on the bathroom floor. And the boy at the touchline watching his father watch him, and the man who had paid every price and kept the weight and carried the question and never found the answer, and was here anyway, here, still on the pitch, still with the ball at his feet and the morning coming and the work about to begin. He took the first touch. The ball moved exactly as he told it to. He was alone. He was entirely, perfectly, irreducibly himself. He began.